I'm Charles Bartlett from the University of Delaware. We're going to work again on, of course, another Delphacid and your Delphacid key. You have in front of you 3 specimens representing 2 genera, all of which have this general appearance, meaning that they have, if you look at them in dorsal view, the dark part, the lateral part of the mesonotum is dark, the median part is pale, giving it a pale median vita, and it's not always super obvious to you, but once you're familiar with the shapes of Delphacids, you would observe that the vertex is probably a little longer than wide, and the head is very slightly projected. So all 3 of those will key in the same general direction of the key. So probably what we should do, just so that we're all on the same page, is there's one that you have either from Korea or Vietnam that takes this general form, and we'll run it through the key, and then we'll look back and compare it at some level against the others. We're going to proceed maybe a little more quickly than we had on some of the others. The first couplet reads, once again, the post-tibial spur spine-like or the post-tibial spur flattened. And if we turn this guy so we can see the spur, just happens to be out where we can see it pretty well. You'll see right here is the spur, and you might be able to make out the black tip teeth along that posterior margin, which happens through the margin that's towards you. So this spur is what I would call foliaceous. You know, it's certainly not spine-like. And once again, it bears the black tip teeth. So with that, we can go on to couplet 3. And couplet 3 asks about the sperm conducting tube of the Aediagus. I'm going to try and get it more or less in lateral view. Not being very cooperative. Okay, here we go. So here, of course, is the male genitalia. This is the pygrapher. This is segment 10. You can see processes on segment 10. Here's segment 11. Here's the Aediagus right there. Here are the parameres that you just sort of see. And you can probably see the connective right here that attaches to the base of the Aediagus, which is kind of curved like this. And if you can see, if you look carefully, there's something going on along the side of the Aediagus that actually is a row of teeth that is, you know, useful at the genus and species level. But if you look at the Aediagus very carefully, I'll give it a little more magnification, you will observe that once again the Aediagus is one single fused structure, and there's no evident sperm conducting tube to be seen. So the sperm conducting tube is not clearly sclerotized and evident. There's no vestigial flagellum. You know, there's no well-developed phallotheca, so that whole list of things is not the case, nor is there a subanal process which would be projected out here somewhere. So this is not either Stenocronini or Caliciini. It is in the subfamily Delphacinae. That brings us to 7. And couplet 7, once again, asks whether it's a fragile green form. If I can put this under the scope for a moment. Once again, pin out of the way. we can observe that this is clearly, it is not green, it is not particularly fragile, the head is not pointed, so it is not Sarcaracidinae. So it is in the tribe Delphacidae. We'll move on to couplet 8. Couplet 8 asks whether the antennae are terete or rounded in cross-section or flattened. Here are the antennae right here, which are quite clearly round in cross-section. So that sends us off to couplet 13. Couplet 13 asks if the frons has distinct pits, and I shouldn't have moved it. If we look at the frons of this guy, you can see that the frons is quite smooth. You can see that the carinae, the lateral carinae and the median carinae are very, very obvious in this, and it's dark in front. That eventually will become important. But there are no pits or anything resembling pits. So we'll move on to couplet 15. Couplet 15 asks if the median carinae is divided all the way down to the base so that there's 4 total carinae, so lateral carinae and paramedian carinae, but this is divided up here. And actually, if you observe very, very carefully and rotated it just a little bit, you might discover that it's very narrowly divided down to about there. That's actually a genus-level feature, but it's not always particularly clear. So the median carinae of the frons is single or forked closer to the fastigium. That sends us to couplet 19. 19 asks about the pygophore. So this couplet is asking whether this portion of the pygophore right here, that's the opening, the ventral margin of the opening of the pygophore, whether its base has elongate processes or not. And if you look at this, it is a completely normal ventral margin. You can see the dark rim. If processes were present, they'd be present right there in front of the parameres. So those processes are absent. That sends us to 28. 28 asks about the front legs, whether the front legs have expanded tibiae or not. I should say front and middle legs. So we can see, so the couplet reads, fore and middle tibiae distinctly expanded. Here's the front tibiae, and it is perfectly normal, robust chestnut-colored species with white spots on the frons. None of that is true, so we're going to move on to 29. 29, once again, asks whether the frons has spots on it or not, and the frons is immaculate without spots, so it is not Bakerella. We'll move on to 30. 30 asks if the body is compressed. So the easiest way to see that is get it in lateral view and look particularly at the head, but the whole body in lateral view. And if it were compressed, then this angle of the head would be much sharper, but it's pretty roundly curved, and it's not flattened in any way at all, actually. So this one, we would go with the body not being compressed. So that sends us to 35. 35 asks whether the calcar has black-tipped teeth or not. And we've already seen that, but we can always remind ourselves, if we get this way, you can see right on the posterior margin, there are indeed black-tipped teeth. I wonder if I can get it. Very fine black-tipped teeth right along in here and in here of the calcar. So the teeth are present. And I should say, one of our extremely common eastern Delphacids does not have those teeth, and that's Liburniella ornata. extremely common patterned winged Delphacid in the eastern United States. But we're going to couplet 39, which asks about whether the parameres, get this guy back in focus. So the question is, male parameres distinctly branched, either Y-shaped with distinct inner and outer branches or multiply branched. So if we look at the parameres, which are right in here, we will see that they are apically bifurcate. Now I'm going to show you another specimen which is the same genus but a different species. And in this case, if you look, you can particularly see it on the right, on the paramere to our right. Over here, this paramere has a big outer branch and a small inner branch. This is also what I would call branched. So slightly different forms, but the parameres are branched. Now, we're going to come back to this couplet on a different specimen momentarily. So this is branched, so that sends us to couplet 40. 40 asks thorax with distinct pale median vita, which we already know is the case. So you can see that you have a pale median stripe. Now, this one and the next one that you have are both in the genus Sogatella. The one from Southeast Asia is Sogatella furcifera. The other is Sogatella colophon. So let's look at some genus level features, and then we'll separate those two. And then we got to come back and look at Tagasodes, which is very similar but would go a different direction in a couplet we just saw momentarily. So thorax with distinct pale median vita. Median crinea frons forked below the fastigium. And this is a tricky character because it is not always clear. And in fact, I think the specimen I'm looking at right now, I would be hard-pressed to cleanly evaluate that particular feature. But I think if you look at the specimen of colophon, and it's more evident to me, but it's... So what you're looking for is you're looking right here is the median crinea of the frons, and where is that divided? It's divided all the way down here, so at those arms are fairly closely pressed to each other. So this is divided on the face below the fastigium, kind of between the compound eyes, as opposed to being divided closer to the top of the head. That is a feature that tends to be true of Sogatella. It's not absolutely cleanly true. And it also tends to be true of the genus Tagasodes, which is very similar to Sogatella. Paramere is asymmetrically Y-shaped. We just saw that. I'll bring that back because we need to contrast this. Here are our parameres, and let me get the other one in focus. Well, here are the parameres, and this one, the outer lobe is just a little thicker than the inner lobe, and if we look at the other one, which I can actually see more clearly on the right side than on the left, but this is the outer lobe of the paramere, and this is the inner lobe, and that's the outer lobe, inner lobe, and that's the outer lobe. The outer lobe is longer than the inner lobe, and the one on the left, which is Sogatella colophon, is very distinctly so. On the right, which is Sogatella furcifera, the two arms are much more close in their size. Now, Versifera, of course, is the white-backed plant hopper. And the white-backed plant hopper has been misidentified as being present in the New World a number of times, partly because this group of Delphacids can be hard, and there is some variation among specimens and regions and so on some of these features. But if you look at the parameres, it's just bifurcate at the apex, and the inner and the outer lobe are fairly similar in size. It's just kind of shallowly bifurcate, but you would definitely call it bifurcate. But if we went over and looked at colophon, and this would also be true of Molana if you happen to get it instead of colophon, and we look at the parameres, you would find that the outer lobe is pretty long and the inner lobe is short, making it a pretty deeply bifurcate. And the shape is fairly different. But if you had the suspicion that you might have Versifera, there's something that's a little easier to use, but you have to know for sure that it's Sogatella. And that is something I'll show you in just a moment. If you look at the face of Versifera, you would discover that the face is dark, the geni are dark, and you have the pale corini here. That is in contrast to Versifera. You see that the face of Versifera, face of colophon is pale. Now, that pretty cleanly separates colophon from Versifera. The little problem you have is that Sogatella molana, which is also fairly common, is separated from colophon by the fact that the geni and this part of the frons is dark. So in other words, you could more easily mistake molana for Versifera, but still you can go back to the shape of the parameres, because the shape of the parameres of molana are very close to colophon. So no wonder there's confusion in the group. But you shouldn't ever mistake colophon for Versifera, because Versifera is dark-faced and colophon is pale. Now, molana is a slightly different story, but molana you should have the shape of the parameres. And that helps us a great deal with Sogata, and you shouldn't be making Sogatella, and you shouldn't be making the mistake of confusing those. Now we need to go back and point out something that's going to be a little hard to point out very cleanly. And that is, particularly in these circumstances, but we'll try. If we look at the pygophora, this is Sogatella versifera. You know, here's the Aediagus sticking up there. Here's our parameres. The diaphragm is running right behind the parameres, and right in here is what we call the armature of the diaphragm. And Sogatella, the armature of the diaphragm is what we call trough-shaped. So if you follow the top of the diaphragm across, you come down to that trough and you go back over. And if you get it in lateral view, which is pretty hard to do in this circumstance, you'll see that it's not projecting, not projecting out caudally. Those things are as opposed to the next thing we'll look at. And what we'll do, instead of going all the way back through the beginning of the key, what we'll do is step back. So this right here is a member of the genus Tagasodes. This happens to be Tagasodes or Rhizocolus. And so what we'll do with this is step back to this couplet number 39. So if you go to couplet 39 and you look at the parameres, you would realize that the parameres are broad, and they're, in this particular species with a Rhizocolus, they're kind of sinuate apically, but they're not bifurcate. So if we go back to 39, the genus Tagasodes does not have bifurcate parameres. The other thing that will be a little difficult to point out has to do with the nature of the diaphragm, which I probably can't reveal very cleanly here. Fortunately, we can't get it very cleanly, which I didn't expect we would. But once again, you know, the pygophore, here are the parameres, here's the ADA sticking up there, and right in here is the diaphragm. Now, in a Rhizocolus, the diaphragm is similar in shape to Sogatella, with one important exception. That is, if you find the top of the diaphragm and you follow it across, it's projected upwards and back if you got it in lateral view. So this in caudal view looks kind of the same in that it's almost trough-like, except if you follow it laterally, you'll realize it's actually projected up, as opposed to being a trough that's pushed down, that's flush. It's pushed up, and you have a bifurcate process. If I had Tagasodes cubanus, it wouldn't be this shape at all. It would be just a kind of a single projection. So those are the two differences that are most obvious between Sogatella and Tagasodes: the shape of the diaphragm and the shape of the parameres. The parameres are not bifurcate, and the diaphragm is projecting. So if we go back to 39, instead of going with branched, we go with not branched. That brings us to 43. 43 asks us about the processes on segment 10. And this is kind of the first time we've looked at this. So I'll get it so you can see them. It's going to be a semi-lateral view. So the processes of 10, so this is segment 10, and here are the processes right here. They're fairly short and they're stout. They're somewhat separated. But the question is, are they strongly converging? No, they're parallel. Or are they distinctly asymmetrical? No, they're symmetrical. So these are slightly separated, parallel processes on 10. That's a very common sort of condition. So that sends us to 45, where you would also go if the processes were absent. So if you go to 45, is asking median choriony of the fronds, which is right here, is forked approximately a ventral margin of eyes, and it's forked right down there. So that's true. And the arms of the fork are well separated. You can see the arms here, and they're pretty well separated. And the fronds is rather two-toned. So I'm showing you this just to contrast it with the one that you have in front of you. This is Peregrinus matus, which would key out in this couplet, but what you have is something else. Just again, just to show you what the feature is. Peregrinus matus is very common as a corn plant hopper. So if you look at the one that you had in front of you, it's going to look something along these lines, where in this case the median choriony of the fronds actually is forked down there, but the arms of the fork are very close, and the fronds is not two-toned, so it's not pale up here, not dark down there. So this specimen that you have in front of you is not peregrinous, and we need to go on to couplet 46. Couplet 46 is asking whether the body is two-toned. So couplet 46 reads, body bicolored, posteriorly uniformly yellowish-brown, head and usually anterior part of thorax dark brown. So if that were true, this would be yellowish, this would be dark brown, and none of that is true. So we need to go with body coloration varied, not as above, and if we wanted to look at genital features, we could, but there's no need. So we move on to 47. 47 is asking about the pygophore, and I need to get this in focus here. I'll explain the feature and I'll show it to you. Here is our pygophore. We can get a little more magnification on it. So this couplet reads, male pygophore in lateral view strongly and conspicuously expanded on dorsal caudal angle. So what it's asking is, in here, is it greatly expanded? And we can get this in a little more in lateral view and see what it looks like. And if it were greatly expanded, you would see it right in here. So that's not what's going on here. Let me show you something else. If we look at this specimen, here we are. We have it now pretty well in lateral view. So if you look at this margin of the pygophore, you'll realize that it comes out and expands all the way out here. And if we get it more in caudal view, if I can, you'll actually see that the lateral margins of the pygophore go up and kind of curl around right here. So clearly, the specimen that we're looking at doesn't have any of that going on. We're going to come back to this one in just a moment. So the specimen we're looking at keys to male pygophore lateral view not expanded. So we go to 55. And if we go to 55, the question is, are the parameres widely diverging? And so you get it in caudal view or ventral caudal view, something like this. And here we are looking at it from caudal view. Here are our parameres. Parameres widely diverging, rather narrow and sinuate, following the lateral margin of the pygophore. So they should be widely diverging and following this margin of the pygophore. None of that is true. Parameres variable, but if strongly diverging, then basal angles developed. So the basal angles are down here, and actually they're developed, and this is not following the lateral margin of the pygophore. That's a somewhat hard character, but one of our very, very common northern species, Javicella, Fulicida, or all the genus Javicella, have the parameres very widely diverging and narrow, and this is not at all like that. So we'll go on to 57. 57 is asking whether the Adiagus is strongly curved downwards, and all we need to do is get this more or less in lateral view and more or less in focus, and we'll discover that the Adiagus is actually ever so slightly up-curved, not strongly down-curved. So it's beyond that, it's not Falcotoya. Falcotoya is pretty uncommon. So we'll go on to 58. 58 is a little tricky. Wings clear with dark marking at the apex of the clavis. So if you get it and look at it like that, So what we're looking for is, are the wings clear, and is there a dark marking right up there? And in this particular case, maybe. We go on and have to read the rest of it fairly carefully. Species usually dark in color with conspicuous pale carini, median carini of frons forked near fastigium, pronotum pale posteriorly. That is opposed to wings variable but usually without marking at apex of clavus, if present. Some Tagasodes, then paler taxa with strong median mesonodal vita. What you have has a strong median mesonodal vita. So what this couplet is doing is separating a few characteristic species, particularly in the genus Chionimus. Chionimus is usually a very, very dark genus, uniformly dark with a pale carini and very distinctive carini in the frons. This one has a pale median vita, so it's a little tricky because you have to go with the or part in the second part of the couplet. That brings us to 60. Processes on 10. So we go back to the genitalia. Processes on 10 absent, but they're right here. So they're present. That brings us to 63. 63, mesonotum with strongly developed median vita. We know that's present. Median carini of frons forked below fastigium. We know that's true. Processes on 10, somewhat approximated. That's a relative feature. So what you're looking at is Tagasodes and will fit those features. There's two common Tagasodes. One is Rhizocolus and the other is Cubanus. The tail we were looking at was a Rhizocolus. So I'm going to give you a quick fixed feature to separate a Rhizocolus from Cubanus. This is Tagasodes cubanus. Tagasodes cubanus, well, aside from the parameres being a very different shape, it tends to have the median carini, median carini of the frons is very strongly marked with white. But if we go and look at Rhizocolus, if I can find it, you will discover that the median carini is not broadly white, and there's a tendency for the median carini to not be divided, but be divided closer to the fastigium. So this is Tagasodes or Rhizocolus, and the other one is Tagasodes cubanus. Both are very, very common and very easy to mistake them for Sogatella. Now, if I have another couple of minutes, I want to step back and look at the last thing you have, which looks something like this. You have a pale species, and when you look at the frons, frons is somehow variably dark. This is a fairly dark one, where the frons is darkened in here. Frequently, the darkness is only right along the carini. Now, if we go back, we need to go back to couplet 47. 47 asks about, what 47 asks about is the margins of the pygophore were greatly expanded. And I showed you this one briefly that has this greatly expanded margin of the pygophore. So in this case, it's true. So couplet 47, male pygophore and lateral view strongly and conspicuously expanded on dorsal caudal angles. That is true. That brings us to 48. 48 asks if the expansion is kind of mid-lateral as opposed to dorsal. So what you do is look in lateral view, and the question is the expansion down here or up here? And the expansion is right at the dorsal margin of the pygophore, so it is not Onconodes. Onconodes is a really uncommon thing you're not likely to see, so that sends us to 49. 49 asks if segment 10 has processes or not. If we rotate this and I get it in focus, we will be able to see that segment 10 right here has a pair of very closely approximated processes. So couplet 49, segment 10 without processes versus 49, segment 10 with processes. We go to couplet 50 because the processes are very clearly there. 50 asks if the dorsal caudal expansions of the pygophore are inflected medially, which is to say that when you get the pygophore so that you can see it in caudal view and you look for where those expansions, the shape of those expansions, you'll realize, and you can see it pretty clearly over here, that the expansions come up and they're bent towards the middle. That's as opposed to being a straight expansion. So this is exactly what we mean when the dorsal caudal margin of the pygophore is strongly inflected medially at the apex. Body usually pale, all of that is true. We go on to 51. 51 is a long couplet that's asking more or less, is this the genus Elastodelphax? So in Elastodelphax, if we looked at the expansion of the pygophore, so dorsal caudal expansions of the pygophore bent medially into a pair of lobes. So there is a single lobe here, not a pair. Paramere is usually short. The parameres go all the way up, almost touching those lobes. You know, the tip of it is almost inflected underneath those lobes, so that's not true. Carinae of the head and thorax concolorous with foveae, which is to say, if you looked at the face, and get this underneath the scope again, is the foveae and the carinae the same color? And the answer is no, the foveae are dark and the carinae are pale. So all of that is just not working for us. So we're going to go dorsal caudal expansions of the pygophore not forming a pair of lobes, if similar, and so on. The carinae of the head are conspicuous, often pale margined with fuscus. That's probably exactly what you have. That brings us to 52. 52 is going to ask us whether it's Toya, and the question here has to do with the armature of the diaphragm. So if you look at it in caudal view, there we go, very nice. Here are parameres. Here's the diaphragm back here, and you see this projection right in here. That's the armature of the diaphragm. So couplet 52 asks, armature of the diaphragm wider than tall, usually forming a wide U shape. But if we look at this, you'll discover it's taller than wide. It's taller than it is wide. Adiagus of most species with upcurved row of teeth, and so on. But in this case, the armature of the diaphragm is taller than wide, forming a median projection on the dorsal margin of the diaphragm. So we go to 53. 53 is going to ask genital diaphragm apically bilobed or trilobed. Paramere is weakly concave apically. What we're doing with 53 is asking is it Harmalia, which is an introduced taxon to southern Florida that may not even persist in Florida, or is it Metadelphax? Metadelphax is extremely common, found worldwide, everywhere, from Chile to Canada, from Siberia to South Africa to Australia. It is everywhere, and you will see it. So this is Metadelphax propinqua.